Hello, and welcome to the first part in my American Imperialism set of lecture videos. Today we will be taking a look at American imperialism starting with the opening of Japan in the 1850s, and then we will be kind of going through American expansion up until roughly the annexation of Hawaii. And so without any further ado, let's get started. I want to begin briefly with giving a small bit of backstory talking about American expansion before 1898. So, American merchants had been trading with the Chinese at the port of Canton since 1785. And the reason we're bringing up Canton in China is because a lot of American imperialism generally extends into the Pacific in Asia, and not really talking about like places like Africa. American imperialism usually extends to some of South America, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. So our foray into colonialization was in terms of islands and governing islands for use as refueling stations for trade. So eventually we have something called the Treaty of Wanghia, which is our first real step into China. And in 1844, essentially, American Representative Caleb Cushing secured a most favored nation status from the Imperial Chinese government. And this meant that the United States would receive the same treatment from the Chinese as they would from their most favored nation, in the sense that any new powers or abilities bestowed on a foreign country by the Chinese government would also be bestowed on the United States. Additionally, because of this, 4 new ports were open to American traders in China, because around this time the Chinese were somewhat entered into the sphere of isolation and coming out of their isolation, but not 100%. So some limited trade was going on, and additionally a lot of European nations had already made a lot of agreements with the Chinese. We were a little bit late to that party. We're going to look at that a little bit more in a future video. But moving on from there, we are going to talk about the opening of Japan, which is our first major foray into Asia. And so, concerning the opening of Japan, before the 1850s, Japan was in a period of isolation from the outside world. And the reason they had done this was a little bit similar to the reason the Chinese had done that many, many years before, was that the imperial power feared the corruption of Japanese culture from outsiders. What happened with the Chinese was they actually sent several voyages out to see the rest of the world, and looking at kind of areas like the Middle East, Persia. There's a theory that they landed in the Americas and met some of the Native Americans living on the West Coast and in South America. And essentially the Chinese decided, oh, we're much more advanced than these people. What do we need them for? So they decided to go into isolation to kind of preserve their culture and withdraw into themselves, because they felt there was no need to trade with the outside world. That kind of came back to bite them later, because they wound up getting heavily colonized by European nations later on, and they had not advanced while in their isolation technologically very much. So as a result, they found that they were much far behind the Europeans in terms of technology. And the same thing is true of Japan. So President Millard Fillmore sent Commodore Matthew C. Perry of the Navy to establish diplomatic channels for communication with the Japanese in the 1850s. And what happened was Perry came with 3, quote, black ships. He took 3 U.S. Navy steam-powered warships, painted black for intimidation purposes, and he arrived in Japan and asked to speak to the emperor, and he kind of scared the Japanese quite badly, because they did not know what this was. They had never really seen ships like this before and people like this before, with technology that they had never seen. Because something important to keep in mind, and we're going to look at this a little bit more tomorrow, the Japanese were still running around with swords and medieval-style melee weapons, and did not have things like gunpowder guns, steam power, kind of things that a lot of Western countries had. And so Perry, to kind of further demonstrate this show of power, brought gifts to the emperor. And things he brought was a working model of a steam locomotive. He brought a telescope. He brought a telegraph. And he also bought a lot of wines and liquors that were from the West. And he said he would return the next year for an answer from the government with a much larger fleet. And he didn't really say it outright, but there's an impression there that he said, I'm going to leave. You've seen the stuff we have. I want you guys to trade with us. Here's this letter that the president has given me asking you to open up your ports to have some more diplomatic relations. I'm going to come back in 1 year for your answer. When I come back, I'm going to bring a lot more ships than I have now, a lot more of these ships, just to keep in mind. So there's an implication there that if they don't sign the treaty, they might face war with the United States, with this country that has much more advanced technology than they do and much more advanced weaponry than they do. And the Japanese realize, oh crap, we can't fight these people. We, as much as we don't want to, we're going to have to trade with these people. And so that decision results in the signing of the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, 3 years later. And so Japan would protect the idea with the Treaty of Kanagawa. Essentially what it did was it said that Japan would protect stranded seamen, and it would also allow American vessels to refuel and replenish their supplies in ports in Japan. The two ports that were opened to trade to the United States were Shimoda and Hakodate. The U.S. was also given the right to appoint consuls to live in these port cities, so we could have representatives living in the city to interact with the government. And the treaty additionally gave the United States a most favored nation clause, which stated that any other concessions to foreign powers would also be granted to the United States. So that's what the most favored nation means. So it's like if for example, the Japanese were to give England an ability or a concession that they had not given us, they would be required to give us that concession. And the reason that we wanted Japan, not so much for resources, because the Japanese islands do not really have a lot of resources. We wanted the Japanese islands because we wanted a coaling and refueling station for ships en route to the Pacific. And where that's going to be a very common trend is that the reason we go after a lot of these islands is because we are trying to get to China to trade with the Chinese. So they have a lot of resources and a lot of markets. And we're going to basically need places for ships to refuel with coal and water for their steam boilers, and also to rest occasionally, because it's a very long distance from the Pacific, across the Pacific from America to China. And so Japan was to be one of those places where we could refuel ships and have them dock if necessary. Additionally, the Americans also started looking during this time period at Hawaii. Again, we had like Japan, we had and China, we had a history with Hawaii as well. American traders, whalers, and missionaries had been slowly moving to the Hawaiian Islands since the 1790s. And in 1849, the U.S. declared that the Hawaiian Islands could not be allowed to be ruled by another power, expanding the sphere of influence of the Monroe Doctrine. So they're saying the Monroe Doctrine also applies to Hawaii, not just to South America. So they're kind of expanding it. And then President Pierce actually attempted to annex Hawaii in 1854, but he wound up having to put the issue on the table, under the table, and put it away due to the question of slavery. The idea being that, okay, if we do annex Hawaii, can they have slaves? They've got a lot of tropical area. They got a lot of plantations. Slaves could work there. And he was like, let's not talk about that right now, because slavery is a bit of a hot topic at this time during American history. And this same problem also later defeated Pierce's efforts to purchase Cuba, Alaska, and also Lower California. And when I say Lower California, what I mean is not really California, if you think of it now, kind of like part of Mexico. That there's like a peninsula that's like the Californian Peninsula that goes off the western coast of Mexico. He wanted to purchase that too. But every time this came up, people in the South were like, well, can we have slavery there? And he was like, actually, maybe we shouldn't buy this area. And so that's one of the reasons why you see less expansion before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, America is free to expand with territory without the question of slavery in any of these new areas we might acquire. And so, as a result of this, this was desperately needed because the nation, being industrialized, we were kind of hungering for new markets and sources of raw materials. So places we could mine raw materials to manufacture into goods, and then sell those goods back to those areas to make money and get rich in the process, of course. The biggest proponent of expansion after the Civil War was the Secretary of State named William H. Seward. He had been appointed by Lincoln, and he was still in the cabinet during the Reconstruction era. And so he kind of was the champion of the cause of the outward expansion during the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, and his first big accomplishment was the Alaska Treaty in 1867. And during this, Alaska was purchased from Russia for $7.2 million, and in 2019 dollars that would be $37 billion. That's a lot of money. Seward believed that this territory was very valuable. He believed it accomplished by buying it, we would be removing another European power from North America, so the Russians are no longer in North America. He also felt that it would be a good place to put military bases in which we could attack Canada and eventually annex that after a war, after thinking we should go to war with England again, annex Canada, and then we'd get rid of the British in North America. So now he's got 2 for 1 in his kind of fantasy that I don't know why we would do that, but we didn't. And many in Congress were actually less enthused about this idea. They called the purchase of Alaska Seward's folly, and they also called it Seward's icebox because Alaska is very cold. Additionally, he expanded a bit more with because Alaska later on actually proved to be quite valuable because gold was discovered in the Yukon Valley, and we know how much Americans love gold, and people in general love gold. And the amount of gold found actually paid for Alaska several times over. That's a lot of gold. Additionally, they found North Slope oil in Alaska, and there are still reserves of oil in Alaska today that we are kind of saving just in case. And also because if we were to start mining up the oil in Alaska, it would destroy a lot of the beauty of nature there, so we kind of want to preserve some of that. And this vast, untamed wilderness was a new frontier for Americans because we started to settle more and more of the West, so they decided this is a new place we can move to. And Alaska kind of today is still considered one of the last frontier, untamed areas of the United States because there's not a lot of people who actually live there because it's just too cold, too mountainy, too rocky, too many wild animals, bears, moose. It's a very, very foreboding environment. Very beautiful, though, I will admit. Additionally, Seward kind of moved into the Caribbean as well, or the Caribbean, depending on whether it's pirates or vacation. He organized a treaty in 1867 to purchase the Danish West Indies, which is now called the U.S. Virgin Islands, for $7.5 million. And the wheels of the Senate turned very, very slowly during this process. And so the islands did not really become a part of the United States until 1917, and we paid $25 million for them. And if you look on this slide, you see the picture on the top is of the U.S. Virgin Islands, very beautiful, and the picture on the bottom is of Alaska, it's also very beautiful. Now, you may question, where are the Virgin Islands? Well, I added a little map here to show you. If you look, you can see they are just kind of to the west of Puerto Rico, the kind of small 2 or 3 islands located just to the east of Puerto Rico, a few miles off the coast. So kind of that's about where they are, a little in the middle of the Caribbean. Additionally, during this time, we see a lot of trouble wind up rising in Mexico. So Napoleon III, who is the current emperor of France, wanted to reestablish a French empire in the Americas. This is the empire that had been gotten rid of when Napoleon I sold Louisiana to Thomas Jefferson. So he's kind of like, I want to get some of that back. And so what he essentially does is he takes over Mexico. He sends an army there, they overthrow the existing government, and then he installs a man named Maximilian, who was an Austrian archduke, and you can see him in the right there, as the Emperor of Mexico. And this was obviously a very blatant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. However, while the U.S. strongly objected to this invasion, we were kind of a little bit busy with something called the Civil War at the time, so we were kind of fighting the Confederacy, and we didn't really have the time or the ability to intervene while this was all going on. So we said, look, that's bad, you shouldn't do that, but we're kind of busy right now, so we'll deal with you later. So that was where we left it at until after the war. We eventually wound up reaching an agreement with France in which they would remove their armed forces in Mexico after we started moving soldiers in Texas to the kind of border with Texas and Mexico and threatened saying, hey, look, guys, it's later. You guys got to get out of Mexico or else we're going to invade Mexico and kick you out by force. And they went, okay, with a French accent. And so as a result, they moved their troops, but they left Maximilian in power. However, because he had no more French backing and military to back up his authority, what eventually happened was there was a revolution that took place, and he was executed as a result of the Mexican people not really liking him that much being in power, and so he was replaced with a different government. And now we come to one of my personal favorite parts, talking about the Navy. And so by 1900, the United States was the third largest naval power in the world. And also at the time, the country was in the middle of the grips of depression, labor unrest, and populism. And American citizens began questioning why we need this large navy when the taxpayer money probably could have been better spent somewhere else, dealing with, like, some of these problems we're seeing during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. They're like, hey, shouldn't you guys maybe do like social programs or something instead of having a very large navy that we don't really seem to need right now? Because we're not going to war with anybody right now. What do we need a navy for? That was kind of the thought process there with some of that thing. And so this question of why do we need this large navy? Well, a man named Alfred Thayer Mahan, a captain in the Navy, who was also a founding member of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, produced an answer to this question. He wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in it, he basically expunged a theory. He said that to be strong in the modern world, the United States needs to sell its products on all continents internationally. I doubt he was including Antarctica because nobody really lives there, but you know what he's trying to say. We need to sell our products that we make here in this country everywhere around the globe. And he's like, to be able to secure these foreign markets, we need a powerful navy, because important thing to remember, one of the most important geopolitical things you could say about the United States is that we live on a more or less large island bordered by two very large oceans. So that's good for protection, but at the same time, it's difficult. That means that it's difficult to get to another continent from where we live. Because of that he's saying we need a large navy to protect any ships that we need and secure trade routes to get to somewhere else so we can sell our stuff and make a lot of money. Because making a lot of money is good. That's one of the things about history. Generally, along with eating is good, people across the time in history have agreed that having a lot of money is usually good. So, because of that, he said, a quote from his book, he said that control of the seas made and kept a nation great. And kind of some of the other things that Mahan called for was a canal across Panama. He wanted control of Samoa and Hawaii for use as refueling stations and naval bases, as I mentioned earlier, that philosophy of using refueling stations to get to Asia. And this message resonated with two senators, Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts and one Theodore Roosevelt from New York. We're going to see a lot more of him later in the second half of this series. But Lodge's kind of thing, he actually took this message and started expunging it, and he started calling as well for a larger navy, the annexation of Hawaii, and a canal across Panama, as well as the purchase of the Virgin Islands for uses as naval bases and such. He also stated, quite interestingly, that we should purchase both Greenland and Cuba. So that'd be quite a lot of interesting kind of alternate histories there. If we had purchased Greenland and Cuba and made those states, or at least territories, it'd be very interesting to see. And while we're on this subject talking about expansion, I want to kind of explain what the American expansionist philosophy was. So the ideas generally shared by a lot of the people who are pro-expansion was that the world is filled with weak nations. And American power is extended internationally only to be used as a force for good. So we're only doing this because it's the right thing to do and we're doing a good thing. And they're saying that other nations, meaning the nations we're expanding to, should be glad to be ruled by such a benevolent nation as the United States. Because one of the things that is important to note, or an interesting little paradox, is that we were a country that was once colonies. And now here we are, a country made of former colonies that is now creating colonies of their own. So part of the philosophy there is that, well, we were once a colony. We understand the problems of being a colony and the problems of being ruled by a country that doesn't know what's going on. But since we've been a colony before, we've done this, we understand the other guy's side of view, so we're not going to make the same mistakes as the big European powers and stuff like that. So we're not going to be like raising taxes and doing tyrannical things because we know what it's been like to be treated that way, so we're not going to be that evil. Or so they said. We're going to see later that didn't always turn out that way. And additionally, Americans would profit by reaching new markets abroad. So again, by reaching these new markets, we're going to make a lot of money. And again, general rule of history, having a lot of money is generally a good thing. And I think a perfect example that I found in the book of what this philosophy was a quote by Senator Albert J. Beveridge of Indiana. And he said, American factories are making more than the American people can use. American soil is producing much more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours. We will establish trading posts throughout the world as distributing points for American products. We will cover the ocean with our merchant marine. We will build a navy to the measure of our greatness. Great colonies governing themselves, flying our flag and trading with us, will grow from our posts of trade. And so he's saying that, like, we need to be expressing, kind of summing up those ideas of we need to expand, we need to have a large navy to cover these ports, and additionally, these countries, because we're trading with them, are going to grow to be really strong and really powerful because we're going to give them all the stuff we don't need or can't use, and they're going to grow and become powerful and make money as well. So he's kind of looking at, you could almost compare a trickle-down economics point of view. And so moving on from there, I want to speak a little bit about the annexation of Hawaii. And if you notice, it's spelled a little bit strangely in the title. That's because the actual way that you should pronounce that, I've been told, is Hawaii. So for them, the W is a V. It's Hawaii, not Hawaii. It's Hawaii. But I'm going to just say Hawaii for ease of use. The way I've also heard described is that the whole islands as a whole is called the Hawaiian Islands, but the island of Hawaii is called Hawaii. There's like an island named Hawaii, and then there's the Hawaiian Islands. So it's a little bit of a difference. But in 1891, Queen Liliuokalani came to the throne of Hawaii, and you can see her in the bottom right picture there. She attempted to shake off American influence and preserve imperial rule in the Hawaiian Islands. So she kind of was a little bit of tried to take a few steps back, saying, no, we don't really want to be as much under the influence of you guys as we had previously. We want to remain independent as an independent country. We've been this way for hundreds of years. We don't really need your guys' influence. And this angered a lot of the American settlers who had been living in Hawaii. And in January 1893, they wound up overthrowing the imperial rule and instituted a democratic government that was largely run by Americans, people of American origin. They elected Sanford B. Dole as the president of Hawaii, and interestingly enough, he was also the president and founder of the Dole Fruit Company. So Hawaii, an area that's largely known for harvesting fruit and sugar, becomes a democratic country after being overthrown, and the man elected president is the president of a major fruit company. It sounds a little bit, suspicious. Maybe, has a fact that he... Could you maybe say it's another example of perhaps vertical integration? Instead of taking over the railroad, you just take over the country that's owned by that your fruit plantations is living in. And so after this government comes to power, they sent a treaty of annexation to the United States, and it was sent to Grover Cleveland, who was actually a noted anti-expansionist. And Cleveland was also a little bit suspicious as to why suddenly Hawaii encouraged a revolution and overthrew the government, so he sent an agent to research why the Queen had been overthrown. And Cleveland's agent kind of comes back and says, hey, guess what? And he gives him a bunch of information, and he finds out the American minister to Hawaii had backed the revolution. And Cleveland hears this and he goes, what? Why? And he freaks out, and he's desperately, he says, no, we got to undo this. This isn't right. This is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. We shouldn't be messing with stable governments that are already in power. This is our bad. I'm sorry. We shouldn't have done that. And so he kind of attempts to restore the Queen's power, but it was kind of too late, and he was unsuccessful in doing so. And eventually, Hawaii wound up being annexed as a U.S. territory after the Spanish-American War in 1898. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the Spanish-American War in the next video. So I will see you all then. That's going to be the next video's coverage will be the Spanish-American War. And so that's all I really have to discuss today. Thank you for showing up. You guys have a good rest of your day.